Imagine, for a moment, two starkly contrasting images. In the dusty, sun-baked landscape of a World War II internment camp in America, captured German soldiers, the very architects of a global conflict, sat down to surprisingly lavish dinners. Plates piled high with steak, fresh-baked bread, and steaming cups of coffee were not uncommon. They were enemies, yet treated with a level of provision that many American citizens at the time might have envied. Now, fast forward 2 decades, to the humid, dense jungles of Vietnam. Here, captured Vietcong fighters, often no older than teenagers, found themselves in a vastly different reality. They crouched, sometimes for weeks, in cramped tiger cages, rudimentary bamboo and barbed wire enclosures, barely large enough to sit, let alone stand. Covered in lime powder to prevent escape and stifle disease, their existence was one of constant degradation and unimaginable suffering. 2 enemies of America, 2 wars, 2 profoundly different fates. One was fed like a guest, even a valued one. The other was caged like an animal, stripped of dignity and humanity. This is the shocking, often uncomfortable story that America, for decades, preferred to keep hidden. Tonight, we delve into this profound dichotomy. The surprising leniency extended to German prisoners of war on American soil, juxtaposed with the brutal treatment meted out to Vietcong captives. We will explore the underlying reasons, the moral implications, and the lasting legacy of these 2 profoundly different approaches to wartime captivity. Prepare to confront a chapter of history that challenges our understanding of justice, compassion, and the true cost of conflict. The contrast is not merely anecdotal. It is a documented, systemic difference in policy and practice. During World War II, over 370,000 German prisoners of war were held in camps across the United States, predominantly in the South and Southwest. Far from deprivation, these individuals experienced a standard of living that often astonished them. Their daily rations frequently exceeded 3,000 calories, a diet richer and more varied than that of many American civilians during wartime rationing, and certainly more substantial than what their own families in war-torn Germany were receiving. Mess halls served 3 square meals a day, often featuring fresh meat, vegetables, and fruit. Many camps even had canteens where POWs could purchase additional items using scrip earned from labor. This labor was another fascinating aspect. German prisoners were put to work, often in agriculture, alleviating critical labor shortages. They picked cotton, harvested corn, and worked in canneries, earning wages that, while modest, allowed them to buy luxuries like tobacco, candy, or even beer. This treatment wasn't merely out of kindness. It was a calculated strategy, rooted in the Geneva Conventions and a reciprocal expectation that American prisoners of war in Germany would be treated similarly. But the psychological impact on the German soldiers themselves was profound. Many arrived expecting a weakened, impoverished democracy, as Nazi propaganda had relentlessly depicted. Instead, they encountered a land of unprecedented abundance, efficiency, and a standard of living that utterly shattered their indoctrinated worldview. They witnessed, firsthand, the industrial might and agricultural bounty of the nation they had been told was teetering on collapse. This experience, for many, was a powerful de-radicalizing force, leading to a significant re-evaluation of their political beliefs. The stakes in America became a symbol of a prosperity they had been taught was impossible. Now, shift our focus to the Vietnam War, a conflict waged just 2 decades later, but under entirely different rules, or rather, a deliberate bending of them. Captured Vietcong fighters and North Vietnamese Army regulars found themselves in a grim reality that bore no resemblance to the relatively comfortable existence of their German predecessors. The Geneva Conventions, The very international agreements that had largely dictated the humane treatment of German POWs were conspicuously ignored or circumvented when it came to the Vietcong. The primary reason for this denial of basic human rights stemmed from a controversial classification. The United States and South Vietnam refused to grant Vietcong captives official prisoner of war status, instead branding them as criminal insurgents or illegal combatants. This distinction was crucial. By denying them POW status, the authorities argued they were not bound by the Geneva Convention's protections, thereby justifying methods that would otherwise be clear violations of international law. This legalistic maneuver opened the door to widespread abuses. The infamous tiger cages on Con Son Island, a former French colonial prison, became a symbol of this brutality. These were small, roofless concrete pits, often just 5 by 9 feet, designed to hold multiple prisoners. Here, men and women were crammed together, exposed to the elements, enduring extreme heat and cold. Guards would often pour lime powder down on them, causing severe burns and respiratory problems, a tactic designed to inflict pain and psychological torment. The conditions were beyond squalid. Sanitation was non-existent, leading to rampant disease and infestations. Food and water were minimal, barely enough to sustain life. Psychological torture was common, with prisoners subjected to sleep deprivation, constant noise, and the ever-present threat of violence. The aim was not rehabilitation or even basic internment, but rather to break their will, extract intelligence, or simply to punish. The contrast with the German POW experience could not be more stark. One group was seen as a professional army, albeit an enemy, deserving of certain rights. The other as subhuman criminals, deserving only of suffering. The striking disparity in treatment between German POWs and Vietcong captives was not accidental. It stemmed from a complex interplay of legal interpretations, political expediency, and prevailing societal attitudes towards the enemy. For the Germans, America adhered, for the most part, to the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. This was a pragmatic decision. The U.S. had its own soldiers captured by the Axis powers, and reciprocal treatment was a powerful incentive for compliance. The expectation was that if America treated German POWs humanely, the Germans would, in turn, treat Allied POWs with similar respect. This mutual understanding, though imperfect, provided a framework for a baseline level of care. Furthermore, post-war reconstruction and the emerging Cold War landscape meant that a defeated Germany could potentially become an ally. Treating their soldiers with a degree of respect, even generosity, was seen by some as an investment in future relations, sowing seeds of goodwill rather than resentment. The goal was eventual reintegration, not perpetual enmity. For the Vietcong, however, the landscape was entirely different. The conflict was viewed by many in the U.S. and South Vietnam not as a traditional war between nation-states, but as an insurgency, a fight against communism and internal rebellion. This allowed for the legalistic sidestepping of the Geneva Conventions. By defining the Vietcong as unlawful combatants or terrorists, rather than soldiers of a recognized state, the argument was made that they forfeited the protections afforded to regular armies. This reclassification, though fiercely debated by international legal scholars, served as a convenient justification for the harsh measures employed. The enemy was dehumanized, making their brutalization more palatable to those perpetrating it and to a public largely unaware of the extent of the suffering. This was not about reciprocal treatment, nor about future alliances. It was about crushing an ideology and an enemy deemed illegitimate. The ethical implications of these two approaches are profound and continue to resonate. For the German POWs, the American adherence to the Geneva Conventions, even with its strategic underpinnings, underscored a commitment to international law and a baseline of human decency, even for an enemy. It demonstrated a nation capable of distinguishing between the ideology of Nazism and the individual soldiers caught within its grasp. This approach, while not purely altruistic, arguably contributed to a smoother post-war reconciliation and the eventual integration of Germany into the Western Bloc. It preserved a moral high ground, reinforcing America's image as a beacon of democratic values. However, the treatment of Vietcong prisoners represents a stark moral compromise. By circumventing the Geneva Conventions through reclassification, the United States and South Vietnam effectively sanctioned practices that were, by any humanitarian standard, torture. The tiger cages and similar facilities became sites of systemic abuse, violating fundamental principles of human rights. This denial of basic dignity, the deliberate infliction of suffering, not only tarnished the moral standing of the forces involved, but also proved counterproductive in many ways. Rather than breaking the will of the Viet Cong, it often hardened their resolve, fueling anti-American sentiment and providing powerful propaganda for the North Vietnamese. The long-term consequences of such actions are indelible. The revelations of the tiger cages, brought to international attention by brave journalists and activists, ignited widespread outrage and further eroded public trust in the conduct of the war. It raised uncomfortable questions about the limits of acceptable warfare, the definition of an enemy, and whether the ends truly justified such means. The legacy of this period continues to haunt discussions about human rights in conflict zones, reminding us of the slippery slope that can emerge when legal definitions are twisted to rationalize inhumanity. The contrast forces us to confront the hypocrisy inherent in treating one enemy with relative respect while subjecting another to unspeakable cruelty, all within the span of a few decades of American history. The stark difference in how America treated its enemies, whether German soldiers or Viet Cong guerrillas, reveals a profound shift in military and political strategy, influenced by the nature of the conflicts themselves. World War II was a conventional war between nation-states, fought by uniformed armies. The rules of engagement, including the treatment of prisoners, were relatively well-defined, and adherence to conventions was seen as a measure of a civilized nation. The enemy, while brutal, operated within a recognizable framework, making reciprocal treatment both practical and strategically advantageous. Vietnam, however, was a different beast entirely. It was a decolonization struggle, a civil war, and a Cold War proxy conflict, all rolled into one. The enemy was often an irregular force, a guerrilla movement deeply embedded within the civilian population. This blurred the lines of combatant status and challenged traditional military doctrines. The frustration of fighting an elusive, determined foe who did not wear uniforms or fight on conventional battlefields contributed to a dehumanization that paved the way for harsher tactics. The insurgent label, applied to the Viet Cong, was not merely a legalistic technicality. It reflected a deeper ideological struggle. In the minds of many American and South Vietnamese officials, these were not honorable soldiers, but communist terrorists operating outside the norms of warfare. This perception allowed for a suspension of the moral code that had largely guided POW treatment in earlier conflicts. The enemy was no longer seen as a fellow combatant, but as an existential threat to be eradicated by any means necessary. This shift from a conventional war mindset to a counterinsurgency framework had devastating consequences for those captured. Where German POWs were seen as individuals who might one day return to a reformed society, Vietcong prisoners were often viewed as irredeemable enemies, their ideology so dangerous that extreme measures were justified. This fundamental difference in how the enemy was perceived, driven by the nature of the war itself, ultimately sealed the fate of those who fell into American and South Vietnamese hands. It represents a chilling example of how strategic necessity and political narrative can erode ethical boundaries in wartime. The historical record reveals a complex picture of public and official awareness regarding these contrasting realities. During World War II, the presence of German POW camps across America was a visible, if not always widely discussed, aspect of the home front. Local communities often knew of the camps, sometimes even benefiting from POW labor. While specific details of steak dinners might not have been front-page news, the general adherence to Geneva Convention standards was part of the American narrative of fighting a just war with honor. There was no widespread public outcry over the treatment of German prisoners. In fact, their conditions were often considered a testament to American prosperity and adherence to international law. Fast forward to Vietnam, and the narrative becomes far more obscured. The atrocities committed against Vietcong prisoners, particularly in facilities like the tiger cages, were largely hidden from the American public for years. The South Vietnamese government, with U.S. support, maintained strict control over information, and access for independent observers was severely limited. When reports of abuse did emerge, they were often downplayed or dismissed as enemy propaganda. It wasn't until 1970 when a congressional delegation, including Representative Tom Harkin and aide Don Luce, visited Con Son Island and exposed the horrific conditions of the tiger cages to the world, that the full extent of the brutality became undeniable. This revelation caused an international scandal and a significant backlash within the United States, further fueling the anti-war movement. The images and eyewitness accounts were damning, shattering any illusion of a morally superior war effort. The stark contrast between the carefully curated image of American conduct and the grim reality of the tiger cages forced a reckoning, albeit a belated one. It exposed the chasm between stated ideals and actual practices, revealing a deeply uncomfortable truth about the compromises made in the pursuit of victory against an enemy deemed unworthy of fundamental human rights. The story of the tiger cages became a symbol of the moral quagmire that was the Vietnam War. The consequences of these divergent policies extended far beyond the immediate battlefield, shaping post-war perceptions and international relations. For the German POWs, their experience in America often became a powerful tool for denazification and a foundation for future reconciliation. Many returned to a devastated Germany with stories of American abundance and fairness, directly contradicting Nazi propaganda. This personal testimony helped to dismantle ideological barriers and fostered a sense of goodwill that would prove invaluable in the rebuilding of West Germany and its eventual alliance with the United States during the Cold War. The humane treatment was, in essence, an investment in a future partner. In contrast, the brutalization of Vietcong prisoners left an enduring legacy of bitterness and resentment. The images of emaciated captives in tiger cages, the accounts of torture, and the denial of basic human rights fueled the anti-American narrative throughout Southeast Asia and beyond. These actions became potent symbols of perceived Western arrogance and cruelty, reinforcing the Vietcong's resolve and galvanizing international condemnation. Far from breaking the enemy's spirit, the abuses often strengthened it, creating martyrs and deepening the ideological divide. The lack of adherence to international norms not only damaged America's moral authority, but also complicated its efforts to win hearts and minds in the region. The long-term impact on America's global standing was significant. The revelations from Vietnam contributed to a crisis of confidence at home and abroad, leading to increased scrutiny of U.S. military conduct in subsequent conflicts. The shadow of the tiger cages lingered, making future arguments for humanitarian intervention or moral leadership far more challenging. While the treatment of German POWs laid groundwork for a strategic alliance, the treatment of Vietcong prisoners created wounds that would take generations to heal, both within Vietnam and in the collective memory of international human rights. The ethical implications of these divergent approaches are profound and continue to resonate. For German POWs, American adherence to the Geneva Conventions, even with its strategic underpinnings, underscored a commitment to international law and a baseline of human decency, extending even to an enemy. It showcased a nation capable of distinguishing between Nazi ideology and the individual soldiers caught within its grasp. This approach, while not purely altruistic, arguably contributed to smoother post-war reconciliation and Germany's eventual integration into the Western Bloc, preserving a moral high ground that reinforced America's image as a beacon of democratic values. In stark contrast, the treatment of Vietcong prisoners represents a significant moral compromise. By circumventing the Geneva Conventions through reclassification, the United States and South Vietnam effectively sanctioned practices that, by any humanitarian standard, constituted torture. The tiger cages and similar facilities became sites of systemic abuse, violating fundamental human rights. This denial of basic dignity and deliberate infliction of suffering not only tarnished the moral standing of the forces involved, but also proved counterproductive. Far from breaking the will of the Viet Cong, it often hardened their resolve, fueling anti-American sentiment and providing powerful propaganda for the North Vietnamese. The long-term consequences of these actions are indelible. Revelations of the tiger cages, brought to international attention by brave journalists and activists, ignited widespread outrage and further eroded public trust in the war's conduct. It raised uncomfortable questions about the limits of acceptable warfare, the definition of an enemy, and whether the ends truly justified such means. The legacy of this period continues to haunt discussions about human rights in conflict zones, serving as a reminder of the slippery slope that emerges when legal definitions are twisted to rationalize inhumanity. This contrast compels us to confront the hypocrisy inherent in treating one enemy with relative respect while subjecting another to unspeakable cruelty, all within the span of a few decades of American history. From the steak dinners enjoyed by German prisoners of war in World War II to the horrific tiger cages that confined Viet Cong captives, the American experience with its enemies presents a stark and challenging historical duality. We've seen how the strategic decision to uphold the Geneva Conventions for German soldiers, influenced by reciprocity and the hope of future reconciliation, not only de-radicalized many, but also laid groundwork for a crucial post-war alliance. It was a calculated act of statesmanship, cloaked in humanitarian principle, that ultimately served America's long-term interests. Conversely, the denial of POW status to the Viet Cong, rebranding them as criminal insurgents, paved the way for a brutal campaign of interrogation and confinement that flagrantly violated international norms. This shift was driven by the unconventional nature of the Vietnam War, the dehumanization of an irregular enemy, and the intense pressures of a Cold War proxy conflict. The deliberate concealment of abuses, eventually exposed to global condemnation, not only fueled anti-American sentiment, but also deeply tarnished the nation's moral standing and complicated its future diplomatic efforts. This historical journey compels us to confront uncomfortable truths about the flexibility of international law in wartime and the profound impact of political narratives on the treatment of human beings. It reminds us that how a nation treats its adversaries is not merely a matter of ethics, but a powerful determinant of its strategic success, its global reputation, and its own self-perception. The stories of those fed steaks and those confined to cages serve as enduring lessons, urging us to remain vigilant about the principles we claim to uphold, even in the darkest hours of conflict. For in the treatment of our enemies, we often reveal the true measure of ourselves.